Welcome to our podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." Today's episode, my favorite medieval epic, a tale of violence, vengeance, and betrayal. So, Elle, what do you think my favorite medieval epic is?
I would have thought Beowulf. You're a historian of Anglo-Saxon England, not to mention a Tolkien fan from way back. But the title of this episode says it's not Beowulf. I don't think it's Song of Roland. Is it Niall's saga?
Love both of them, and I still can't believe you vetoed the name Skarpheden for a son. But my favorite medieval epic is a more obscure late 12th century chanson de geste called Raoul of Cambrai.
Can't say I'm surprised. I know you assigned it in your medieval classes, and you even got me to read it. And I can see how it follows on to our William Marshall episodes. William Marshall may even have heard it during a tournament feast. The title character, Raoul of Cambrai, is temperamentally the opposite of William Marshall. One of Marshall's chivalric superhero qualities was his amazing mesure, his ability to restrain emotional responses to affronts. I love the story of how Marshall responded to King John's malicious lie about the deaths of his favorite household knights and the mortal wounding of his friend John of Burgh while defending Marshall's lands in Ireland. Marshall gravely told the king, "That's dreadful. Everyone here, even the dimmest, knows they were your worthy vassals. That makes this sorry business even worse. Now that's mesure."
I also see Raoul of Cambrai as the anti-Song of Roland. The Song of Roland, written at the time of the First Crusade, about a century before Raoul of Cambrai, is one of the earliest and is certainly the best known of the French epics of chivalry known as the chanson de geste. For those of our listeners who haven't read it, the Song of Roland tells the story of Charlemagne's nephew Roland and how his stepfather, the traitor Ganelin, plotted with the Muslim king of Spain to kill him in an ambush of Charlemagne's rearguard in the Pyrenees mountain pass of Roncesvalles. Roland is a great teaching text. The story is fast-moving and features 2 battles and a trial by combat. It has truly heroic heroes in the brave, if a bit stubborn, Roland, his best friend, the wise Oliver, who advises him to blow his horn to recall Charlemagne's army, which Roland refuses to do until it is too late, lest it shame him, and the warrior cleric Archbishop Turpin, who wields a mean crozier. The poem also shows how little those who went on the First Crusade actually knew about Islam, as the poet represents the Muslims as pagans who worship an unholy trinity of stone idols that include Mohammed.
You've just made a good case for assigning Song of Roland, and there are a lot of good inexpensive translations. Why prefer Raoul? It's been a long time since I read it, but I remember it as a mess in terms of character development and hyper-violent to the point of being Monty Python.
Right on both counts. I like it because Raoul of Cambrai is ambivalent about motivations and because it's a bit of a mess. In the Song of Roland, the poet sets up a dilemma. Ganelin has been insulted by Roland. Does he have a right to take vengeance by dooming his lord Charlemagne's rearguard to defeat and massacre? The knightly audience would have sympathized with Ganelin's desire for vengeance. Roland had shamed him in public and laughed at his discomfort. But the poet's answer is a resounding no. Ganelin's treachery is not against Roland, but against their lord Charlemagne. He may have had a right to plan the killing of the man who insulted him, but not if it meant violating his sworn oath of loyalty to his lord. The poet drives the point home to the intended audience, the young knights in a baron's, or in this case probably a king's court, by having God decide the issue in a patently uneven trial by combat. When Ganelin is punished by being pulled apart by horses and his 30 kinsmen who stood surety are hanged, no one listening to the poem could doubt that that was justice. The Raoul poet also asks really tough and relevant questions aimed at both barons and knights. Does a king have the right to dispose of counties as he pleases, or are these hereditary familial property? Does homage create a relationship for life, or can a man rightfully renounce his oath of fidelity if his lord wrongs him? Unlike Roland, Raoul of Cambrai doesn't give a clear-cut answer to either question. The The poem culminates in an inconclusive trial by combat meant to answer the latter question. Even God punts on whether a wronged vassal can rightfully defy his lord. Raoul is a great vehicle for understanding the attitude of the great barons of late 12th century France and England to the rising power of kings and their goal of imposing royal authority on them. As a teacher, I came up with a Raoul take-home quiz that served as a reading guide. Elle, you've read the poem, which I'm afraid is more than I can say for some of my students, so you should get all the answers right. But I'm not going to put you to the test. Instead, I'm going to call up someone who hasn't read the poem, my old friend Carol. Hi, Carol. How's it going?
Good, good.
I told you I'm going to give you a quiz.
Yeah, I'm excited since I know nothing about medieval history.
You're perfect then. Okay. Question 1, and this is multiple choice. Imagine that you were a French household knight and the bastard son of a count. Can you imagine that?
It's a stretch, but I think I can do it.
Good. The Weaselly king has just confiscated the county belonging to your father and your uncles and given it to your own lord, who's also your childhood friend. You respond by A, yelling at the emperor that he has no right to make this grant, as your father and uncles did nothing wrong. B, you warn your lord that your kinsmen are really tough and that he should settle the matter lawfully before he does wrong to them and suffers for it. C, you pull out your hair.
I would have to say B because it shows a little macho.
It does show macho, but the answer is all of the above, including pulling out your hair. 2, you are the nephew of the king or emperor, and he has just given you the lands of a recently deceased count because he's given away your rightful patrimony to another knight. Your mom tells you not to accept the gift. Instead, you should ask the sons of the late count, who was a friend of your father, to help you recover your own lands. You reply to mom by saying, A, thanks, mom. You're right. It would be shameful for me to take the lands of my father's friend. B, mom, you're right, but it is the emperor whom I should attack for giving away my patrimony. C, a knight who takes advice from a woman before going to battle is a coward. Go and plan meals for your household, lady, and fatten your tummy, because you aren't fit to meddle with guy stuff.
I would have to guess that they would say C. Also, I never take advice from my mother.
Okay, 3, you are again a household knight. Your lord orders you to attack a nunnery because it belongs to his enemy. He further orders you and the other knights to spread his tent in the middle of the church, tie his falcons to the gold crosses, and set up his bed by the altar. He tells you that he plans to lean against the cross and give the nuns to his squires. You respond, A, why to the squires, not to us? B, do we get to keep the gold crosses? How about the falcons? C, you tell your lord when he reproaches you for failing to follow his orders that you are not a Jew and not a tyrant, but you end up doing it anyway.
Wow. I would have to say C. I'd like to think I put up a little fight.
And C is the right answer. I kind of like B. I wanted the gold crosses, but I can do without the falcons. 4, you tell your mom, the abbess, that you don't want to follow your lord because he is worse than Judas. But you then add, he is my lord. He's given me horses, weapons, and clothing. I wouldn't fail him for all the wealth of Damascus. Your mom replies, son, by my faith, you are right. Serve your lord and God will be your reward. True or false?
I think true.
Even if your lord is worse than Judas?
Yeah, I mean, horses. I like horses. And anyway, I think that that's probably what they thought, is that you should be completely loyal.
And that's the right answer. Okay, 5. Your sworn lord did you wrong. Which of the following wrongs would he have to have done to you before you renounce your sworn allegiance to him? Ready?
Okay.
A. He attacks the lands of your father and uncles with the intention of driving them into exile. B. He insults your mom, who has become an abbess, by calling her a cheap whore. C. He sets fire to her convent and she is burnt to death. D. He strikes you in the head with a lance when you complain to him about mistreatment and does it in front of the other household knights.
Ooh, tough question. I would have to guess A, because I would think B and C, the women probably don't count very much.
That's a good answer, but it's wrong. It's D.
It's D.
It's D. Getting struck in the head really is what breaks it. Well, the head also. Okay, 6. Your lord's other knights tell him that he's done a bad thing by striking you. He agrees and asks for your forgiveness, saying that he will make amends for the wrongs he has done. He'll even carry your saddle on his shoulders and walk about a mile with it. You tell him, A, I will forgive you if you stop this war against my family. B, I will forgive you if you build a new convent and dedicate it to my mother. C, I will forgive you if you give me 12 horses and a new suit of armor. D, I will forgive you if the blood running down the side of my head flows back into my head.
Oh, I have to go with the last one. I love the magical nature of it.
And that's the right answer, which is another way of saying, I am not forgiving
Never.
you.
Yeah.
Never. Final question. You've renounced your loyalty to your lord for having hit you in the face with a lance and having burnt your mother alive. Do you now have a right to kill him in combat?
Wow. I would have to say no. You're probably supposed to have allegiance no matter what.
That's a good answer, but here's the poet's answer. I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Welcome to the wonderful world of Raoul of Cambrai. Thanks, Carol. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
You might want to begin by explaining to our listeners what a chanson de geste is.
Chansons de geste were French medieval epic poems sung or recited by minstrels in the courts of counts and barons. Their heyday was from the late 11th to the end of the 13th century. If romancers were the chick flicks of the High Middle Ages, chansons de geste were the action hero movies. They are violent and hypermasculine. War, treachery, and betrayal are featured in them. Roland belongs to a cycle of poems about Charlemagne and his Carolingian successors. Raoul belongs to a different cycle that centers on baronial rebellions against royal authority.
You say that this is a late 12th century poem, but I remember you telling me that the one complete surviving manuscript is from the first half of the 13th century.
That's true. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. The manuscript combines two separate poems. The first part, Raoul I, is the only part that we're going to discuss. It's a chanson de geste in rhymed verse. The second part is a romance in assonance, a substitute for rhyme in which the vowels are the same, but the consonants are different. These are obviously two different poems that have been cobbled together in the manuscript. For historians, Raoul I, with its brutally realistic depiction of warfare, politics, and feudal relations, is of far greater interest than Raoul II, which is conventional romance.
You still haven't explained why you date the poem to the late 12th century.
Like so much about medieval history, we can't be certain when Raoul I was composed. I really should have called our podcast Fact, Fiction, and a Lot of Conjecture about the Middle Ages. Raoul I was being sung in courts by 1186, when the knight and troubadour Bertrand de Born alluded to it in a poem. Most scholars would place the date of composition in the early 1180s and relate the poem to the rising discontent of the northern French baronage against King Philip Augustus's attempts to impose his authority over them. The chansons tell stories set in earlier centuries. Raoul de Cambrai is historically rooted in two violent events from the early history of the northern French county of Vermandois. But as with the other chansons de geste, Raoul de Cambrai's chronological setting is incidental to the poet's real purpose, which was to entertain and provide moral instruction for a contemporary noble audience. Much like a John Wayne Western, the poem is far less concerned with historical accuracy than with connecting with its intended audience. Though it is set in a legendary past, the poem reflects the political conditions and aristocratic mores of northern France in the late 12th century, a world in which the civilizing influences of church, monarchy, and chivalry had only begun to tame the warrior nobility of the early Middle Ages. Raoul of Cambrai I was probably composed in the early years of King Philip Augustus's reign. Though he was the anointed king of France and claimed to be the lord of all French counts and barons, the teenage Philip at his accession actually ruled little more than the Ile-de-France, the region surrounding the city of Paris. The royal domain in 1180 was about the same size as the Duchy of Normandy and the County of Champagne, and a lot smaller than the Duchy of Aquitaine. The powerful French counts and dukes, though technically Philip's vassals, ruled their territories in virtual independence. Royal diplomacy meant playing these overmighty barons off against one another, and at this game Philip, as he matured, excelled. He was, in the words of one contemporary, a ruler skilled in stratagems, who put down the wicked of the realm by sowing discord among them.
In some ways, Philip's most important tutor was ironically his rival and theoretical vassal Henry II of England. Henry had managed to impose in his realm a royal common law based on the related legal ideas that all land derived from the crown, and that consequently the king was the liege lord of all landholders. Under Henry II, the feudal polity began to resemble a consolidated state, and the feudal ruler began to assume some of the attributes of a sovereign rather than a mere overlord.
The only way that a 12th century king could increase his power was by increasing his revenues and military might, and that meant adding lands to the royal domain. Here Philip Augustus's marriage to Isabel of Hainaut proved useful. It gave Philip an interest in the rich lands of Flanders and a claim to the counties of Artois, Hainaut, and Vermandois. The king was not to make good on this claim, however, for another decade. His goal in the 1180s was more modest: to keep the powerful Count of Flanders, who also claimed Vermandois and Hainaut by marriage, from gobbling these lands up. To do this, Philip used a clever mixture of military action and diplomacy that was meant to keep his barons from ever uniting against him. That he claimed Hainaut, the county in which Cambrai lay, and Vermandois, the battleground of the poem, could not have been lost upon the poem's patrons and audiences.
The real world of the Raoul poet was not all that dissimilar from that represented in his poem. The poem's audience would have nodded in recognition when the poet sang about internecine warfare and kings more interested in enhancing their power and keeping their barons divided than in maintaining law and doing justice. The political universe of the poem, with its crafty King Louis, hot-headed nobles like Raoul and Guerri the Red, and shifting alliances, mirrors the historical reality of the period. Okay, now that we set the scene, how about a quick summary of the poem?
The poem begins with the de facto disinheritance of the infant Raoul, the posthumous son of the Count of Cambrai, and the Lady Alice, sister of King Louis. King Louis has decided that his widowed sister should marry the household knight Gibouin of Le Mans, who had served the king well for many years. Louis warns Alice that if she refuses, Gibouin will nonetheless be given custody of the lands of Cambrai, and Alice will be left with only her dowry to support her and her household. Alice defiantly declares, "I would rather be burnt alive than the king should force a greyhound to lie with a watchdog."
I do love the image of the Lady Alice as a greyhound and the household knight Gibouin as a watchdog.
She and Raoul's hot-headed paternal uncle, Guerri the Red, vow that when the infant Raoul comes of age, he shall have his father's fief.
Isn't Schweben a lot like William Marshall, a household knight being rewarded with an heiress for his good service?
The difference is that a widow could refuse. As I pointed out in the previous episode, the sixth clause of Magna Carta forbids the king, and by extension barons, from disparaging heiresses by having them marry men of lower rank.
William Marshall may have thought it didn't apply to him as the nephew of a count, but others might have disagreed.
Growing up alongside Raoul in Lady Alice's household is Bernier, the bastard son of Count Ibert and grandson of Count Herbert of Vermandois. Bernier's mother, Marcente, as we later learn, is the daughter of a knight who ruled Bavaria. She married a noble French knight who fled to southern Italy after killing 2 royal princes. Abandoned by her husband and far from home, the beautiful Marcente lacked male protectors. This made her fair game for the powerful Count Ibert, who took her by force and then kept her as his concubine. When Ibert tired of her and married another noblewoman, he gave Marcente to one of his knights to wed, but she preferred to become the abbess of Ibert's family convent at Origny.
Ibert raped her? And what does her son have to say about that?
Actually, not much. He calls his father a, quote, most noble man, tells about the rape to defend his mother's reputation, but doesn't condemn his father for it.
This is obviously not a courtly love romance. Unfortunately, I suspect it may be more realistic.
Raoul grows up to be handsome, valiant, and skilled with weapons. So does Bernier. King Louis knights Raoul. Raoul, in turn, knights his childhood friend Bernier, of whom the poet says, quote, there was no handsomer boy in any land, nor any that knew better the use of shield and spear, nor of wise speech in a king's court, even though he was called a bastard. With his knighting, Raoul comes of age. Raoul seems content to be the king's landless seneschal until his other uncle, Guerri the Red, shames and taunts him into demanding his father's fief of Cambrai. King Louis, reluctant to dispossess Gibouin, instead promises Raoul the lands of the next count to die.
Did a French king in the 12th century actually have the right to do that?
Yes and no. In theory, counties and duchies were the gift of a king. In practice, they had become hereditary possessions by the 11th century. A king could try to confiscate the lands of a rebellious count, but to do so required him to raise an army and take it by force. As I said, in the 1180s, the royal domain was smaller in area than some counties and duchies, but the modest size of the royal domain is misleading. At its center was the city of Paris, which was thriving due to the commercial revolution of the 12th century. As Paris grew, so did the revenues of the French crown. Philip Augustus's grandfather, King Louis the Fat, had tamed the great robber barons of the Ile-de-France and established the king's authority and power within the royal domain. Philip Augustus's goal was to extend royal power over the French dukes and counts, especially those counties and duchies held by King Henry II of England and his sons.
And we saw how he did that in our previous episode about William Marshall.
Back to the story. The next count to die is Herbert of Vermandois. Louis reluctantly disinherits Count Herbert's 4 sons and confers Vermandois on Raoul. In effect, this also disinherits Bernier, who is Count Herbert's bastard grandson. Bernier reproaches the king, telling him he has no right to confiscate Vermandois as his uncles have done no wrong. He begs Raoul not to accept the gift, but Raoul thinks it would shame him to do so.
It seems that Raoul is motivated solely by honor and shame. Is the poet impliedly criticizing chivalry's emphasis on honor?
I think he is. The key chivalric quality in the poem is mesure, and mesure requires a noble to be able to temper his sense of honor. Raoul's mother also pleads with her son not to accept what she thinks will be a fatal gift. The really honorable thing to do, she tells him, would be to kill Gibouin and take back his patrimony. Raoul contemptuously dismisses his mother's advice. Angered, the Lady Alice curses her son, saying that if he doesn't abandon his plans, may God never bring him back to her, safe and sound and whole of skin. Raoul storms off, and Alice immediately regrets her curse. Raoul and Guerri gather their forces, and as soon as they cross into Vermandois, they seize herds and herdsmen and burn crops and farms, which is how war really was fought at the time. The army now approaches the wealthy city of Origny, home to a convent founded by Bernier's family. The abbess of the convent is Bernier's mother, Marcente. Raoul orders his men to take the town and defile the convent. Abbess Marcente humbly pleads with Raoul to spare the church, assuring him that he has nothing to fear from defenseless nuns. Raoul insults her, calling her Count Hebert's prostitute and a cheap whore. He also tells her that Bernier fully supports him and doesn't care if his kinsmen are left without a penny. When Marcente promises Raoul that the nuns will pay for maintenance of his men and supply fodder and oats for his horses, Raoul agrees to a truce. Bernier now comes to see his mother for the first time since he was a young child, and sent by her to be raised in the household of Lady Alice. Marcente assumes that the reason Bernier supports Raoul is because he is a bastard without prospects of inheritance. She assures him that he is Hebert's only son and heir. Bernier responds by telling her that that isn't the reason. He says that even though Raoul is more wicked than Judas, Raoul is nonetheless his lord. Bernier adds that Raoul has given him fine horses, arms, and cloths from Baghdad. He won't abandon him until all good men say that it is right to do so. Marcente tells him, serve his lord, and God will be his reward.
The poet probably wasn't conscious of this, but the reference to horses, arms, and valuable clothing highlights the ethos of reciprocity that informed the lord-vassal relationship. Bernier accepted valuable gifts from Raoul, and those gifts, as well as his oath of fidelity, obliges him to serve his lord. As a lawyer, I like the loophole at the end of his explanation. Bernier will stay loyal until the time that all should say he acted rightly. Vague enough, but it is an out.
3 worthless scoundrels in Raoul's army sneak into the town to rob it. They are chased by townsmen who kill 2 of them. The survivor lies to Raoul and claims that the townspeople killed his men for no reason, and they also insulted him. Raoul believes the lies, and seeing this as a breach of the truce, orders his men to take the town. They set fire to the town and the convent. Marcente and her nuns are burnt alive. Raoul, satisfied that he has avenged the dishonor, calls for food and wine. He tells his seneschal to bring roasted peacocks, deviled swans, and venison to feast on. The seneschal reminds him that it is Lent, a time for fasting and repentance, and that he and Raoul's other men have much to repent for having just burnt a convent and killed its nuns. Raoul calls his seneschal a whore's son, apparently Raoul's go-to name for anyone who offers him criticism, and informs him that the townsmen brought this on themselves by killing his men. But he acknowledges that he had forgotten that it's Lent. He cancels the food order and calls instead for his chessboard and wine.
Wait a minute. Roasted peacock? They're native to India. Raoul's baggage train must have been really fancy. And we're supposed to accept that Raoul is pious enough to fast in Lent, but not sufficiently pious to resist the urge to burn and defile churches and nuns? I mean, I know it's only a story, but really?
As Raoul's household butler, Bernier kneels before his lord with a goblet of wine. When Raoul lifts up the goblet and boasts that he will reduce the sons of Herbert to poverty, that tears it for Bernier, who leaps to his feet to confront Raoul. He complains that he has been repaid for his good services and for the love he has shown Raoul by having his mother burned to death and the lands of his father and uncles attacked. Raoul calls Bernier the son of a whore, accuses him of being a spy, and tells him he has a mind to cut off his head. Bernier replies that if he were armed, he would fight any knight to refute the accusation that he's a renegade, and not even Raoul would dare strike him. Raoul proves him wrong by grabbing a lance and cracking his skull. This is too much for Bernier. He calls for a squire to bring him his armor and his weapons because he is leaving Raoul's court. Raoul suspects that he may have gone too far and asks the other knights for advice. They tell him that Bernier has a right to be angry. He has served Raoul well and has been repaid with a burnt mother and a broken head. Chastened, Raoul pleads with Bernier to forgive him. He makes an offer of compensation that would, in the words of Raoul, befit the Emir of Spain or even King Louis, not out of fear of Bernier, but out of love and the desire to restore their friendship. Quote, From Origny to the fortress of Nel, 100 knights shall walk, each bearing his own saddle, and I will carry yours upon my head. And not a man-at-arms or maid will I pass on the road, but I say, this is the saddle of Bernier that I am carrying.
Sounds to me like a ritual of humiliation. I suppose that by carrying Bernier's saddle on his head and acting like and declaring himself publicly to be Bernier's groom, Raoul is humbling himself in elevating Bernier, and by doing so, restoring his man's lost honor.
That is exactly what it is. For someone so protective of his honor as Raoul, it is an extraordinary offer, much better than gold. Throughout the poem so far, Raoul has been the hothead who lacks mesure. All one needs to do is press the button labeled honor, and Raoul goes ballistic. Now it's Bernier's turn. Bernier tells Raoul that he will only forgive him if the blood rolling down his cheeks go back into his head by their own accord. The sentiment of the court now turns against Bernier for his refusal to accept so generous an offer of atonement. Guerri, who has been sympathetic to Bernier's grievances, calls Bernier a presumptuous bastard. My nephew has made a generous offer. From this time on your sentence of death is written on my sword. Bernier's response is a formal declaration of defiance, that is, the withdrawal of his oath of fidelity. Now is my loyalty at an end, Bernier says. This blow has dubbed me your enemy. Bernier bandages his head with a silken cloth, arms himself, mounts his charger, and sounds a loud blast on his horn to summon 5 knights who are his faithful vassals and hold land from him. Bernier and his men ride to join Count Ibert. The poet adds, there was no love shown at the parting of Raoul's men as the procession set out.
Now, I know Carol came up with the right answer in your quiz, but many of our listeners probably think that having your mother burned to death is a lot worse than getting hit on the head with a lance. Then again, Raoul didn't intend to burn her to death. She was collateral damage, and the act wasn't intended as an insult to Bernier. Raoul striking him in public was.
I agree completely. Again, the focus is on personal honor and shame. In the great battle that ensues, Raoul fights so well and bravely that he kills a giant. He then faces Count Ernoux, Bernier's uncle, in combat and chops off his hand. He pursues the wounded Ernoux, meaning to kill him. When another knight steps between them, Raoul slices off that knight's leg. He mocks both by telling them that since one of them now has only one arm and the other one leg, they can be his watchman and his doorkeeper.
Nice joke. Raoul's really a nice guy, isn't he?
Raoul catches up with the helpless Ernoux and taunts him, saying that now even God couldn't save you.
Obviously, that's a mistake. God doesn't like being told that he can't do something, right?
Yep. Ernoux is relieved by Raoul's blasphemy. Bernier rides to his uncle's rescue, but Bernier has had time to think things through and now wants to reconcile with his former lord. Raoul will have nothing to do with it, and they fight. Raoul fights well, but Bernier kills him.
Raoul's death seems overdetermined in medieval terms, doesn't it? Does he die because he denied the power of God? Or because he refused Bernier's attempt at reconciliation? Or because this is a trial by combat that proves Bernier was right to defy his lord? Or maybe because of the Lady Alice's curse? Or because Bernier was a better warrior?
Maybe all of the above, except for God's judgment on Bernier's defiance of Raoul. That is going to be the subject of a formal trial by combat at the end of the poem. Raoul's death temporarily ends the war after many thousands have died. Guerri the Red carries the corpse of his nephew back to the court of the Lady Alice. Alice feels guilt and shame, knowing that her mother's curse had doomed her son. Raoul's fiancée, Heloise, swears that she will never marry because no man could match her dead beloved.
I suppose Eloise is there to remind the audience that Raoul was a worthy knight, except for his great flaw, his lack of mesure. She functions like Roland's fiancée in the Song of Roland, who dies of grief upon hearing of his death.
The poet now introduces a new character, Gautier, Raoul's nephew, whom Alice names her heir and who vows to avenge Raoul's death. Gautier renews the war. Bernier and Gautier face off in single combat, which degenerates into a melee and resolves nothing. Everyone, once more, returns to their homes. King Louis then summons all his barons to his court in Paris. At the great feast, the seneschal, whom the poet says had much to learn, seats Bernier and his uncles next to Gautier and Guerri. Despite the king's peace and the threat that whoever strikes the first blow will be hanged, Guerri loses it while staring across at Bernier, and when served a thigh bone of venison reaches across and strikes Bernier on the head with it. When confronted by the king, Guerri justifies himself by saying that the king ought to have hanged Bernier for having treacherously killed the king's and his own nephew, and challenges Bernier to trial by combat. Gautier steps forward and claims the right, declaring that Bernier is a felon for having slain his own lord. Bernier denies the accusation, asserting that he had formally defied Raoul, that is, renounced his allegiance, and that Raoul was not his lord when he fairly killed him in battle. The king declares that there is to be a trial by combat and orders sacred relics to be brought out for Bernier to swear his innocence and Gautier his guilt. The ensuing combat is fierce and bloody. Bernier has his right ear chopped off but fights on. Finally, both knights swoon from the loss of blood. The king stops the combat. It's resolved nothing. Bernier, at this point, asks Gautier if this war is to last forever and offers reparations. He will surrender to Gautier his lands and serve him as the most humble and poorest household knight. The Lady Alice now appears. Refusing her brother King Louis's embrace, she tells him that he's not fit to rule a kingdom, and that if she were a man, she would prove that with a sword. Seeing Bernier, she grabs a handy crowbar, meaning to brain him. Bernier begs for forgiveness from the woman who raised him, and tells her if she is not willing to make peace, take the sword and kill him. He makes the same offer to Gautier, who tells him that if he doesn't flee to southern Italy, he will see him hanged as a traitor. The whole court then tells Gautier that he is too full of pride, and that Bernier has 1,000 men who will fight and die for him. The impasse is broken by the abbot of Saint-Denis, who orders the warring clans to make peace with each other. Guerri and Gautier are unwilling until the angry abbot tells them that if they don't, he will pray to Saint Denis that they be damned to hell. That does it, and the war is over. But this is not quite the end of Raoul I. Guerri the Red now realizes who really was at fault for all this killing and mayhem. It's King Louis. He declares that the king is a traitor, and it is his fault that Raoul died. He should never have invested Raoul with another man's fief. King Louis threatens to disinherit both clans, and Guerri responds with a call to arms. Guerri's and Gautier's forces join with Bernier's to pillage and set fire to Paris. They then retire to their own lands. The poem ends with King Louis swearing vengeance on them and sending out royal summonses to all his barons to avenge his shame.
Raoul of Cambrai is the most feudal of the chansons. The poem is almost obsessively concerned with legal and moral issues arising from the possession of land and from the rival claims of kinship, kingship, and vassalage. Lord and vassal alike could agree that a fief was a service tenement, land held by a vassal from a lord in return for homage and knight service. Both would have acknowledged that by custom the eldest son of a baron had a presumptive right to enter into his deceased father's fief, after he had paid the lord a proper relief, monetary payment in recognition of the lord's rights over the fief, and performed homage and fealty to the lord. But here the consensus ended. King Henry II of England and King Philip Augustus insisted that the lands and counties held by their nobles ultimately were theirs to dispose of, royal gifts to reward the loyalty and service of the crown's vassals. The barons, on the other hand, preferred to think of their fiefs as hereditary tenures which passed from father to son. Even if they owed services and had to perform ceremonies for their fiefs, nevertheless, they thought the land was theirs. In this dispute over the legal character of the fief, the Raoul poet sides with his baronial patrons. The true culprit of the piece is not the hot-headed Raoul or Bernier, but the king who provoked a war when he invested Raoul with another man's fief. In this respect, the poem is a warning to rulers who would interfere with the property rights of their barons. In England in 1215, baronial fears and resentment against King John, a ruler much like the poem's King Louis, were to explode into the feudal uprising that gave birth to the Magna Carta.
But Raoul is more than a poetic treatise on property rights. It's also a tale of vengeance, vendetta, and betrayal in which the basic bonds of society, feudal loyalty, kingship, family, and friendship, come into conflict. The poet poses key questions for the feudal society to which he belonged. Which is the higher duty, loyalty to a lord or obligation to one's family? How far may a lord push a vassal before that vassal may legitimately renounce his oath of loyalty? What powers and authority do kings legitimately possess? Is nobility a matter of birth or of character? Is bravery sufficient to make a knight a worthy man? The result is a moral puzzle, which neither the poet nor his heroes and anti-heroes can fully resolve.
Though the world of Raoul is violent and brutal, the ethos of chivalry and courtliness still informs the poem. Chivalry was a contested ethos in the late 12th century, and the poet's attitude toward that ethos is ambivalent and complex. He simultaneously celebrates the cult of prowess and honor and criticizes the violence that it generates. The poet's ambivalence is summed up in the character of Raoul himself. Raoul has all the chivalric virtues except for one. He's a man of prowess, honor, and courage. He possesses the skills of a courtier. He's even a lover. But he's a hero with a fatal flaw, his lack of mesure. As in a Greek tragedy, the horrors of the poem are the result of overweening pride and lack of moderation. As the poet wrote, quote, "If within Raoul there would have been a little restraint, there would have been no better knight than he. But because of his excess, the outcome was grievous, for an unbridled man passes his days in sorrow." Close quote. Raoul of Cambrai was composed as an entertainment, but it is also a meditation upon the fragility of chivalric society and the necessity of restraint.
And that is why Raoul of Cambrai is my favorite medieval epic.